The elephant in the room, the rotational system. Members of the Pan-African Parliament from the South and the North want leadership to be elected on a rotational basis to give every region a chance to lead. That's also in keeping with the advice from the continental body, the African Union. But those from the East and the West and Central regions were having none of it, saying this is not provided for in the rules of the institution.
I listen to you, but when I look what the legal officer writes, it's not good. Because in his opinion, he didn't talk about Malabo Protocol that many countries has been ratified. It's the decision of the Assembly. If you want to cancel this Malabo Protocol and they say, we are starting rotation today, we will go.
We are adamant. We are resisting any undemocratic tendency that has encrypted the institution of Pan-African Parliament. The very reason why the AU has taken this decision of rotational leadership is to harmonize the various divisions that are existing, whether language, whether regional, that are barriers that are dividing the African people.
A call to read a letter from the AU's legal department advising the P.A.P. on the election process was not heeded. After a protracted standoff, the Clerk of Parliament took a decision to adjourn the session until October. Members of the P.A.P. have demanded that the African Union send a representative to the next sitting to guide the election process.
To discuss this issue a little further, we're now joined by political analyst and professor in political sciences at the University of South Africa, UNISA, Professor Dirk Kotze. Prof, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thanks very much. Good evening.
For the public watching what's been happening in the Pan-African Parliament over the last 2 days, they might have been quite surprised by the scenes that they saw. But I wonder if it really hasn't been tensions that have been bubbling under for a number of years that finally erupted.
Yes, I think you are correct. In African continental meetings, very often one has a sort of a division between the different regions. Very often the West Africa is very prominent in it, and then some of the other regions also. I've seen it myself in a purely political science academic type of setup, where it exactly the same happened. But we've also seen it with the election of Dr. Dlamini Zuma as the AU's chairperson of their commission, where it was the West Africa that sort of formed a bloc against some of the other candidates and against her also. And that it's something which is very much about prestige. It's about who is regarded as the leading region within the continent. And it is therefore very much about a sense of power, but more symbolic power. It's not very much about, what we associate with governmental power, because the Pan-African Parliament does not have many powers, but it has a lot of prestige. And I think this is what it is all about.
Is it coincidental that a lot of these fault lines are sort of coincide with languages spoken in those countries?
It sometimes are. For example, in the case of Dr. Dlamini Zuma's campaign. But in this case, West Africa, we've seen 3 of the 4 former presidents of the Pan-African Parliament came from either Chad, which is French-speaking, Nigeria, which is English-speaking, and Cameroon, which is predominantly French-speaking. So it's a bit of a combination of it, which makes this issue not necessarily sort of dividing on linguistic or language barriers or differences, but rather about purely regional ones. But in many other instances, there are very strong either Francophone or Anglophone or even Arabic differences in terms of the groups that are formed in the African Union or in other formations on the continent.
I know that with the vice presidents, that there's one that comes from each region. Why is it so important then to have this rotation at the top if the vice presidents are always going to be representative?
Well, I think, again, this is my point, and that is that the president is the visible one. The president is the one that takes the responsibility for and personifies the public, the Pan-African Parliament. And therefore it carries this prestige, this carries the sense of reputation that the person will develop. And it is linked to the individual person as well as the country that they come from. So when we look at the diplomatic relations in general, whether it is at the United Nations or some of the agencies of the United Nations, or in the European Union context, or now in the African context, all of them concentrate even more than usually on the nationality, on the national association that the person has. And that carries a lot of weight.
It's been referred to the African Union mother body, and they're saying that they will wait to get some kind of guidance from Addis Ababa. The question is, what can the AU mother body do or should do in this instance? Because in theory, this organ really ought to be able to sort itself out.
Yes, it should. But I think what we are seeing now is that it's so much consumed in its own issue that there is not really some independent leadership within the parliament at this stage in order to provide that sense of direction which they need at this stage. It is something that I think the fact that the last three presidents all came from West Africa, it was becoming a boiling pot that just blew over now. And I think the African Union, as the mother body, if we can call it that, does have the authority in order to deal with this situation, because the Pan-African Parliament is not yet in the position of, let's say, the European Parliament, which has become very much autonomous or even independent to a large extent, and where the notion of the separation of powers do apply. In the case of the African Union, that principle between the legislative, executive, and the judicial powers are not strictly separated as in many other constitutional dispensations. And therefore, the African Union, in my view, do have the power and the authority in order to take the final decision on this.
Pan-African parliamentarian Julius Malema was on the SABC News channel earlier today, and he said, look, this is the nature of Parliament. Sometimes, things go beyond just being robust, but that they will find each other, and when they do, unity will prevail. I wonder if we will ever really see a unified house in the Pan-African Parliament.
Yeah, one still sees a little bit of the EFF almost in this, but but at the same time, he really much associated himself with the South African delegation. So it is not based on party differences or party political differences that they are really there. They do represent their own countries as a delegation of 5 members of parliament per delegation. And I think this is part of the dilemma, is the fact that they are there in a national capacity. If we look at other continental or broader parliamentary formations, they sometimes become representatives of political parties. In the European Union, they have certain political blocs. They have the Greens, for example, they have the Social Democrats, and then the Social Democrats from, let's say, Germany and the Social Democrats from Sweden work together. So it's not countries that are working with as blocs, but rather political ideologies or political groups. The Pan-African Parliament is still very far away from that type of situation. So there's no overlapping loyalties or solidarity that really serves as a way of bringing the different representatives together based on their convictions or their ideologies or their understandings of policies. And so long as that is absent, I think we are not going to see this crossover that is necessary in the parliament in order for cooperation to develop there.
What do you think is going to be the likely outcome? I mean, it does sound as if there's a strong argument for Southern Africa, 19 years on, never had a chance to sit at the top seat. But at the same time, the other arguments that are coming through is that, look, there should be a ratification process for this new rotational system. And some of these Southern African countries haven't even bothered to ratify this idea of rotation. But it does seem quite a thorny issue now.
It is indeed, because I think what we are seeing now is a type of entrenchment of the Western Bloc, because they possibly have the majority of member states that support them or that constitute that bloc. So it becomes a type of an entrenched position. And I think the other regions will start to resist that or have already started to do that. So the African Union will understand the complications of that, because they themselves, if we look at institutions of the African Union, like, for example, the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, consists also of 15 members, but they, like the United Nations Security Council, consist of the different regions. So they have built it into that system, and that's the other way of talking about a rotational type of situation. The chairperson of the PSC also rotates between the different regions. So that principle is exceptionally well established within the African Union. Even if we look at the judges who have been appointed to the African Court, they are also supposed to come from the different regions and should not be dominated by one or two of the regions. So I think that sense of representativity and inclusivity is very, very strong in the AU. But for some other reason, it's not yet sort of implemented to the same extent in the Pan-African Parliament. And I think they are going to decide on a procedure in order to deal with this, in order to make it more inclusive and more fair in terms of the different participants in the Parliament.
Well, one gets a sense, though, that this is not going to be something West Africa in particular is just going to say, OK, fine, we'll put our hands up, you're right, we'll carry on with your way. Madame Haider really campaigned quite a bit and very strongly to get this position. What do we know about her, and why there's such a strong lobby for her to take over the presidency?
Well, I think, as we've seen, the West Africa has become very prominent. The new head of the World Trade Organization comes from Nigeria. A former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Nigeria have been involved in the campaigning to become the Secretary General of the United Nations. So the Nigeria, for example, therefore, as well as Ghana, has positioned themselves on the continent as world players, as countries that want to deliver leaders that really take the lead in global organizations or continental organizations. And it's very much about prestige. It's very much about the notion, what we call in political science also soft power. And that is that the country demonstrates its attractiveness to other parts of the world. And that is in the form of, for example, an inclusive form of foreign policy that pulls in different countries and different regions. It is about its own culture that becomes very attractive language. And in the case of Nigeria, it is also about to say, well, we are the natural leaders of Africa. There is still a lot of contestation of which country is actually the leading country. South Africa, for example, will in a few weeks' time attend together with India the G7 summit, a little bit later on the G20. No other African country is represented there. So I think some of these leading African countries will say, well, to some extent we must demonstrate that we are part of this bigger league. We don't want to be seen as being lagging behind South Africa so much. So there's lots at stake for many of these countries to demonstrate that they have the capacity, they have the persons, they have the leaders that can fill these positions.
Is it a problem that Mali is under a coup leadership and that it's been expelled from ECOWAS? Does that complicate things for the Mali presidential candidate?
It certainly does, because organizations like the African Union committed itself to democracy, the principles of democracy. In different conventions, it has a specific convention on democracy, elections, and good governance. And it also has the principle of unconstitutional changes of governments that are regarded as as unacceptable. In some cases, these countries are then pushed out of the AU until they have a new democratic dispensation. And one form of undemocratic change of government is, for example, a military one. And countries like, for example, Madagascar at some stage, which was sort of where a change of government happened, in which the military was very much involved. In those cases, they lost their position and were suspended from the African Union for some time, and the African Union even imposed sanctions on them. So that it makes it very problematic for a country if it is regarded as not a constitutional dispensation and not following the basic rules of democracy. So Mali is certainly in a position where it is problematic, and therefore they can't play the role of a leading figure, of playing that role model that's supposed to be played and being seen as the personification for that moment of a very important component of the African Union, especially parliamentarianism, which is the opposite of, or being sort of confronted by a military regime, which is not parliamentary in any respect.
A lot of things get said in the heat of the moment, and I just wonder what your take is in terms of some of the comments that were made about South Africa and South Africa hosting the Pan-African Parliament all of this time, and some of these parliamentarians saying we don't feel safe here. And I suppose a lot of it was really more about reaction to Julius Malema than perhaps the country, but things were said, and I just wonder what it means, if anything, about how South Africa is viewed in this equation.
Well, I think one should not start to generalize about what has happened now in the last 2 days. No, in the past, I've attended a number of times the sessions of the Pan-African Parliament. Sometimes they are actually too monotonous to be really sort of attractive. And I think there are many South Africans that actually don't know about the existence of the Pan-African Parliament in South Africa and the fact that it is at Gallagher Estate. So in that sense, I think it's a safe space for the Parliament up to now. It has provided the infrastructure that was necessary. It's part of the idea that there must be a diversification of the African Union institutions. The Secretariat and the summits are held in Addis Ababa. The court is in Arusha in Tanzania, and the Parliament is here. And some other institutions will later also be established in other African countries. So in that sense, I think for us it's important that the parliamentary seat is here because it represents something of our political culture, and that is that parliaments are very important. While in many instances, when it's not a completely democratic dispensation, the executive or the president and the cabinet and the administration is really the dominant factor in a state dispensation. So the association with the Parliament for South Africa, I would say, is very important as part of this checks and balances that should also exist at the continental level and not only within the individual states. So I would say South Africa will, there's no discussion or there's no consideration that it should not be in South Africa. There's no sentiment that I've picked up to say that it's not appropriate that it is in South Africa or that the members here don't feel welcome anymore. There was at some stage when the xenophobic violence was prevalent in South Africa, there was some unhappiness, obviously, amongst members of the Pan-African Parliament about it. But lately, I haven't heard of anything that really is problematic of such a nature.
All right, that's where we'll leave it this evening. Thank you so much indeed, Professor Dirk Kotze. Thanks for your time.